The bustling city lights of New York painted the streets with hues of gold and silver as people filled the sidewalks, lost in their own worlds. Inside Café Lumière, an upscale coffee shop nestled in the heart of downtown. The ambience was warm and inviting. Soft jazz music played in the background, blending with the low murmur of conversations and the occasional clinking of glasses. Mark Evans, a successful young entrepreneur in his late 20s, sat at a corner table swirling the espresso in his cup absent-mindedly. He exuded confidence, dressed sharply in a tailored navy suit that complemented his dark hair and chiseled features. His phone buzzed on the table, flashing the name of his best friend, Jake. Mark picked it up, saying, "Jake, what the hell am I doing here?" Jake's amused chuckle came through the line. "Come on, man. It's just coffee. Think of it as a social experiment." Mark rolled his eyes. "Social experiment? You said she's different. What does that even mean?" Jake hesitated for a second before replying. "Look, Sarah isn't exactly your type. She's not one of those model types you usually go for. She's more down to earth." Mark leaned back in his chair, gazing at the busy street outside. "So you're saying she's plain or just not attractive?" Jake laughed. "I'm saying she's not the typical girl you'd swipe right on. But hey, you might learn something for a change." Mark sighed heavily. "Fine. But if this turns out to be a disaster, you owe me drinks for a week." Jake's voice was full of mischief. "Deal. Enjoy your date, buddy." Hanging up, Mark checked his watch and groaned. "What am I even doing here?" He muttered to himself. Meanwhile, Sarah Miller, an independent and hard-working woman in her mid-20s, was standing nervously in front of her mirror. Her long auburn hair was styled in soft waves, framing her delicate face. She adjusted the hem of her simple yet elegant blue dress and took a deep breath. "You look great, Sarah." "Stop worrying," said Emily, her best friend and colleague, as she watched her with a reassuring smile. Sarah turned to her with a skeptical look. "Do you think so? Maybe I should just cancel. I mean, he's probably expecting someone different." Emily rolled her eyes. "Don't sell yourself short. If he doesn't see how amazing you are, then it's his loss. Besides, it's just one coffee. No expectations. No pressure." Sarah sighed. "Yeah, just coffee." She grabbed her coat, her heart pounding in her chest as she stepped out into the cool evening air. As the night went on, Mark found himself stealing glances at Sarah, wondering how he could have been so quick to judge. Maybe attraction wasn't always about appearances. Maybe for the first time in a long while, he had met someone truly special. But just as the thought crossed his mind, doubt crept in. Could he really see himself with someone like Sarah? Could he look past his own superficial tendencies and embrace something deeper? Little did he know, this blind date would change everything. Mark sat at his table in Café Mira, absently stirring his cappuccino as he glanced at his watch. He had arrived 10 minutes early, more out of habit than anticipation. He leaned back in his seat, scanning the cafe's warm, dimly lit atmosphere. The place was filled with the quiet hum of conversation, the occasional clink of coffee cups, and the rich aroma of freshly ground beans. Despite the cozy surroundings, Mark couldn't help but feel a little impatient. "What am I even doing here?" he thought to himself. He had already mapped out an escape plan in his head. If things got awkward, he'd fake an important work call or a sudden meeting. After all, Jake had warned him that this wouldn't be his usual type. Mark smirked to himself. "Let's just get this over with." Just then the door chimed, and Mark glanced up lazily, only to freeze mid-sip of his coffee. A woman walked in, scanning the cafe with a confident, self-assured air. Her long auburn hair cascaded over her shoulders in soft waves, and she wore a simple but elegant dress that accentuated her figure without being ostentatious. She carried herself with poise, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she walked toward him. Mark blinked, his mind racing. No way. This couldn't be Sarah. But as she approached, he recognized her from the small profile picture Jake had shown him. Except in real life, she was different, not in the way he had expected. No thick glasses, no awkward demeanor. Nothing that screened, plain, or unremarkable like Jake had implied. Instead, she was effortlessly graceful, and her smile, warm yet mischievous, made Mark shift uncomfortably in his chair. Oh crap, I was not ready for this. Sarah approached the table, a subtle smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Mark? He stood up a little too quickly, nearly knocking over his coffee. Oh yeah, Sarah. She chuckled, extending her hand. Nice to meet you. Mark shook her hand, noting how soft yet firm her grip was. You two, please have a seat. Sarah sat down, smoothing out her dress as she glanced around. I love this place. Have you been here before? Mark cleared his throat, still trying to recalibrate his expectations. Yeah, a few times. It's nice. Sarah raised an eyebrow playfully. That doesn't sound very convincing. Mark chuckled, finally relaxing a bit. Sorry, I guess I'm just surprised. Sarah leaned in a slightly annoying glint in her eyes. Surprised? Let me guess. Jake made me sound like a total disaster, didn't he? Mark's eyes widened in guilt. I wouldn't say that exactly, but yeah, maybe he did exaggerate a little. Sarah laughed, the sound light and genuine. Don't worry, you're not the first guy he's tricked into a blind date with me. I'm sure he had you expecting the worst. Mark scratched the back of his neck sheepishly. Yeah, I guess I might have misjudged the situation. Sarah tilted her head, an amused smile playing on her lips. So do I. Live up to your expectations? Mark hesitated before flashing an honest smile. Not even close. I was completely wrong. Sarah grinned. I'll take that as a compliment. As the conversation continued, Mark found himself easing into it more than he expected. Sarah was sharp, quick-witted, and effortlessly engaging. There was something about the way she spoke, calm and confident, but never arrogant, that made him feel both intrigued and challenged. They talked about everything from their favorite travel destinations to their least favorite movies. Mark quickly realized Sarah wasn't just attractive, she was fascinating. So Jake told me, you're into finance, Sarah asked, stirring her lap thoughtfully. Mark nodded. Yeah, it's not as exciting as it sounds. A lot of late-night numbers and trying not to fall asleep at my desk. Sarah smiled. Sounds riveting. I work in publishing, so trust me, staring at manuscripts for hours isn't all glamorous either. Mark leaned in, genuinely curious. Publishing? So you're the one responsible for all those late-night page-turners? Sarah left, more like making sure the commas are in the right place. But yes, it has its moments. Mark found himself staring at her, intrigued by the way she spoke so passionately about something he had never considered exciting before. This is unexpected. As the evening progressed, Mark started to feel a strange sense of discomfort, not because of Sarah, but because of himself. He had walked into this date with all the wrong assumptions, convinced that looks defined attraction. But here he was, sitting across from a woman who had effortlessly shattered every stereotype he had in mind. He felt a slight tinge of guilt. How many opportunities had he missed because of his shallow expectations? Sarah noticed his silence and tilted her head. Lost in thought, Mark shook his head, offering a small smile. Just realizing how wrong I was about this whole thing. Sarah smirked. I get that a lot. People think they know who I am before they even meet me. It's kind of fun proving them wrong. Mark chuckled. Consider me thoroughly proven wrong. Sarah raised her coffee cup in a mock toast to break expectations. Then Mark clinked his cup against hers, smiling at that. As they sat there, something inside Mark shifted. Maybe tonight wasn't going to be a disaster after all. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something much more interesting than he had ever imagined. The soft hum of conversation filled Café Lumière, blending with the distant melody of a jazz tune playing through the speakers. The dim lighting cast a warm glow across the polished wooden tables, creating an atmosphere both intimate and comfortable. As Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, he found himself doing something he hadn't expected. Listening. Sarah was talking about her work, her voice animated with passion. So in publishing, it's not just about editing grammar and punctuation, you know? It's about finding the heart of the story and bringing it to life. Mark nodded slowly, genuinely intrigued. That actually sounds fulfilling. I guess I always thought it was just fixing typos. Sarah laughed. Her eyes twinkled with amusement. Yeah, that's what most people think. But it's about connection. Helping authors share something meaningful with the world. Mark watched her carefully. She was nothing like he had imagined. There was a depth to her, a quiet strength that was captivating in a way he hadn't expected. He cleared his throat. And what about you? Do you write? Sarah hesitated for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. I used to when I was younger, but let's just say life is a way of making you doubt yourself. Mark tilted his head. What do you mean? Sarah glanced at him, a soft smile playing on her lips. In school, I wasn't exactly the popular girl. People had a way of labeling me before they even got to know me. The awkward girl, the plain one, the bookworm. It sticks with you after a while, you know. Mark felt a pang of guilt at her words. He had done the same thing, judged her before even meeting her. People can be cruel, he said quietly, feeling an unfamiliar sense of regret. I'm sorry you had to go through that. Sarah shrugged lightly. It's in the past, and honestly, it made me stronger. I learned that I don't need to fit into anyone's standards to be happy. Mark studied her, seeing her in a new light. She wasn't just interesting. She was resilient. There was an undeniable sense of confidence in her words that he found himself admiring. That's really impressive, he admitted. I wish I could say I see the world that way. Sarah arched an eyebrow. What do you mean? Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. I guess I've always looked at things superficially. Success, appearance, and what people expect from me. And sometimes it feels like I'm just playing a role. Sarah's gaze softened. Maybe it's time to rewrite your story then. Mark smiled, realizing how refreshing it was to talk to someone who wasn't impressed by his status or wealth. Someone who genuinely wanted to understand him. As the evening went on, Mark found himself becoming more open, shedding the facade he usually wore on dates. He asked Sarah about her travels, her favorite books, and the little things in life that made her happy. So, what's your biggest dream? He asked, swirling the remnants of his coffee. Sarah thought for a moment before answering, to open my own little bookstore. Cafe. A cozy place where people can come in, grab a book, and lose themselves in a story. Mark smiled. That actually sounds amazing. Sarah laughed. Yeah, you're not just saying that. Mark shook his head. No, I mean it. There's something really special about creating a space like that. A place that feels like home. Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly. Thank you. Most people just think it's a silly dream. Mark leaned in, his voice softer. Well, most people don't know what they're talking about. Sarah met his gaze. And for the first time that evening, Mark felt an unspoken connection pass between them. This wasn't just a casual date anymore. But despite how comfortable he felt, there was still a nagging voice in the back of Mark's mind. He had always been drawn to a certain type of woman who fit a certain mold, who looked a certain way. Was he ready to step outside of that and embrace something real? He found himself staring at Sarah, wondering why he had been so blind to what truly mattered before. You okay? Sarah's voice pulled him back to reality. Mark forced a smile. Yeah, just thinking. Sarah gave him a knowing look about how different this was from what you expected. He chuckled. Yeah, I was expecting, I don't know, something completely different. Sarah smiled softly. Well, life is a funny way of surprising us. Mark nodded, realizing that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong about everything. By the time the evening ended, Mark no longer wanted to leave early. In fact, he found himself lingering, savoring every moment with Sarah when they finally stepped outside the cafe. The cool night air wrapped around them. Sarah pulled her coat tighter around herself, smiling at him. I had a great time tonight, Mark. He returned the smile, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Genuine interest. Me too. Sarah. Really? Sarah tilted her head. So, does this mean I passed the test? Mark laughed. I think I'm the one who's been tested tonight. Sarah grinned. Good answer. As they stood there, the city lights twinkled behind them. Mark realized something that both thrilled and terrified him. He wanted to see her again, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't care what anyone else would think. The cool night air wrapped around them as Mark and Sarah stepped out of Café Lumière, the city lights twinkling above them like 1,000 tiny stars. The streets were alive with the gentle hum of distant traffic and the soft chatter of late-night wanderers. Mark, who had originally planned to end the night as soon as possible, found himself hesitating. There was something about Sarah, her warmth, her honesty that made him want to stay a little longer. He glanced at her, watching as she adjusted her coat against the chilly breeze. Do you want to take a walk? He asked, surprising even himself. Sarah looked at him with raised eyebrows, clearly amused. Are you sure? I thought you were ready to run for the hills. Mark chuckled, shoving his hands into his pockets. Well, I figured I'd at least walk off the caffeine. What do you say? She smiled softly. All right, but if you get bored, don't say I didn't warn you. They fell into an easy stride, walking down the cobblestone sidewalks of the city. The street lights cast a soft golden hue around them, and Mark felt a strange sense of calm, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. As they walked past a quiet park, Sarah broke the silence. So what's next for you, Mr. Finance? Another big deal. Another long day at the office. Mark laughed, shaking his head. That's usually how it goes. But to be honest, I don't really know anymore. Sarah glanced at him curiously. What do you mean? He sighed, looking up at the night sky. I guess I've been so caught up in work and making money that I never really stopped to think about what I actually want. It's always been about reaching the next goal. But I'm starting to wonder if any of it actually means anything. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I get that. I used to think that way too. For a long time I thought if I could just change the way I looked, I'd finally feel like I belonged. Mark turned to her, surprised by her honesty. You? Why would you ever think that? Sarah gave him a small smile, her eyes reflecting a quiet vulnerability. Because that's what people made me believe. Growing up, I was always the plain one, the average girl. I spent years trying to change different hairstyles and different clothes, but it never really felt right. Mark listened intently, feeling an unexpected pang in his chest. What changed? Sarah shrugged. I guess I just got tired of pretending to be someone I wasn't. I realized I had to start loving myself for who I was, not for who people wanted me to be. Mark was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. He admired the strength it must have taken for her to accept herself in a world that was so quick to judge. That's pretty amazing, Sarah. I don't think a lot of people can say they've done that. She smiled at him. The corners of her eyes crinkled slightly. It's a work in progress, but thanks. As they continued their walk, Mark found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. There was something about Sarah that made him feel like he didn't have to put on an act. I always thought I had everything figured out, he admitted. The career, the lifestyle. But now I'm not so sure. Sarah looked at him with understanding. Maybe it's okay not to have it all figured out. Life's not supposed to be one straight line. Sometimes it's messy. Mark chuckled. You're probably right. But I've never been good at messy. Sarah grinned playfully. Well, maybe you should try it sometime. It's a lot more fun than you think. For the first time that night, Mark felt completely at ease. There were no expectations, no pressure. Just two people walking and talking like old friends. As they reached a small bridge overlooking the river, Sarah leaned against the railing, gazing out at the shimmering water. Mark stood beside her, stealing a glance at her serene expression. How did I get here? He wondered. He had walked into the cafe earlier, expecting nothing but an awkward night. And now he felt different. He realized that this date, this woman, was the best thing that had happened to him in a long time. I'm glad I came tonight, he said softly, surprising himself with his honesty. Sarah turned to him, her eyes meeting his. Me too. They stood there in silence for a moment. The sound of the water gently lapping against the bridge below. Mark suddenly felt like maybe, just maybe, things didn't have to be so complicated. Maybe life was about unexpected moments. Like this one. Sarah nudged him playfully. So does this mean I'm not a total disaster? Mark grinned. Far from it. She laughed. And in that moment, Mark knew he wanted to see her again. Would you want to do this again sometime? He asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Sarah pretended to think for a moment before smiling. I'd like that. As they continued their walk, Mark realized something profound. He was no longer worried about what his friends would think or whether Sarah fit into his ideal image of a partner. He was simply enjoying her company, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. A few days after their evening walk, Mark found himself feeling something unfamiliar longing. He had been on countless dates before, yet none had left him thinking about someone long after they were gone. Sarah had somehow found a way into his mind, and more surprisingly, into his heart. He smiled as he scrolled through his phone, hovering over her number, debating whether to text or call. Just as he gathered the courage, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Jake. Hey man, so, how's it going with Miss? Not your type, Jake teased. Mark rolled his eyes but couldn't suppress a small smile. Actually, it's going pretty well. Jake let out an exaggerated gasp. Wait, hold on. Are you telling me you're actually enjoying spending time with her? Mark leaned back on his couch. Yeah, she's different in a good way. Jake laughed. Wow, I have to say, I didn't see that coming. Remember how you said you'd never survive the date? Guess I win this bet. There was a pause before Jake added casually. By the way, I ran into Sarah earlier. Told her it was cool how she agreed to the whole thing, even though you thought she was going to be a disaster. Mark sat up straight. Wait, what did you say? Jake hesitated. I might have mentioned the bet thing. No big deal, right? Mark's stomach dropped. You told her about the bet, Jake. What the hell were you thinking? Jake laughed nervously. Come on, man. It was just a joke. Relax. But Mark wasn't laughing. I gotta go, he muttered, ending the call. Before Jake could say another word, Mark rushed to text Sarah, but his messages went unread. He tried calling, but went straight to voicemail. He knew he had to see her in person, so he headed to the small bookstore where she worked, heart pounding with each step. As soon as he walked in, he spotted Sarah behind the counter. She glanced up, and the moment their eyes met, her face hardened without a word. She turned away and walked into the back room. Mark sighed and followed, slipping past the shelves of books. Sarah, please just give me a minute. She spun around, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression cold. Why? So you can explain how this was all just a game to you? Mark shook his head desperately. No, it wasn't like that. At least not anymore. Yeah, I messed up. I agreed to the date for the wrong reasons, but that changed the moment I met you. I swear. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. Wow, that's comforting. So what was it? Pity. Some experiments to see if the ugly girl could actually be interesting. Mark ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in his voice. No, Sarah, you have no idea how wrong I was about you. When I met you, I realized how amazing you are. This wasn't a joke to me. Sarah shook her head. Her voice was quieter, but filled with hurt. But it started that way, didn't it? And that's all I'll ever be to you. A challenge you didn't expect to win. Mark swallowed hard. Sarah, please. I care about you, and I'll do anything to prove it to you. Sarah looked away, her resolve faltering for a moment before she whispered. Then prove it, Mark. Show me this isn't just guilt or regret. Show me it's real. For the next few days, Sarah kept her distance. Mark, however, refused to give up. He knew he had to prove to her that his feelings were genuine, not born from a foolish bet, but from getting to know her and realizing how much she truly meant to him. He started by leaving small, thoughtful notes in her bookstore, quotes from her favorite books, encouraging messages, and even a list of things he admired about her. When she ignored those, he found another way. He showed up at her favorite coffee shop and simply waited, hoping she'd give him a chance to talk. One evening, as she exited the bookstore, she found him leaning against a street lamp outside. He looked exhausted but determined. You really don't give up, do you? She said, folding her arms. Mark smiled softly. Not when it comes to something that matters. And you matter, Sarah. Sarah sighed, the anger in her eyes softening into uncertainty. Why are you doing this, Mark? If this is just guilt, it's not enough. Mark, step closer. His voice is sincere. It's not guilt. It's me realizing I was an idiot for not seeing you for who you really are. Sooner. And now, I don't want to lose you because of one stupid mistake. Sarah stared at him for a long moment before finally nodding. Fine, but you better have more than just words. Mark smiled in relief. I will, I promise. The next day, Mark did something he never thought he would. He confronted Jake. You screwed things up, man, Mark said, walking into Jake's office unannounced. Jake shrugged casually. Relax, dude. It was just a little joke. Are you seriously into this girl? Mark stared at him. Yeah, I am. And if you can't respect that, maybe we're not on the same page anymore. Jake smirked. Wow, never thought I'd see you this seriously. Must be something special. Mark's jaw tightened. She is, and I don't want you or anyone else treating her like a joke. Jake held up his hands in surrender. All right, man, I get it. No more jokes. But Mark wasn't just saying it for Jake's benefit. He was saying it for himself to finally admit that Sarah wasn't just a passing interest. She was someone he was willing to fight for. That evening, Mark waited outside Sarah's bookstore again. This time when she saw him, she didn't walk away. "So what's your big plan to prove yourself?" she asked, crossing her arms, but with a slight smile. Mark exhaled, holding her gaze. "I don't have a grand plan, Sarah. All I have is this. I want to see where this goes with no bets and no expectations. Just you and me." Sarah studied him, then slowly smiled. "I guess that's a start." And for Mark, it was all he needed. The familiar hum of Careful Mary filled the air, the soft glow of the overhead chandelier casting warm light over the polished wooden tables. The same corner where Mark had first sat full of preconceived notions and shallow expectations now felt different. Like the beginning of something real, something worth fighting for. He sat there, fidgeting with his cup, his heart pounding with nervous anticipation. The cafe had been decorated subtly, with a few fresh flowers adorning the table and soft music playing in the background. It was nothing extravagant, just simple. Just like Sarah. As the door chimed, his eyes lifted instantly. And there she was, Sarah. She walked in with her usual effortless grace, wearing a soft blue sweater and dark jeans. There was no pretense, no show, just her natural, understated beauty that Mark had grown to appreciate. Sarah hesitated for a moment at the entrance, scanning the cafe before spotting him. Their eyes met, and Mark stood up, instinctively, offering a nervous smile. "You came," he said softly. Sarah walked over, her expression guarded but not unkind. "You asked. I figured I owed you that much." Mark nodded, gesturing toward the seat across from him. "Please sit." She settled into the chair, her hands resting lightly on the table. "So what is this about, Mark?" Mark took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about everything. About us, about how we met and how wrong I was about you. About myself." Sarah's eyes flickered with curiosity, but remained cautious. "Go on." He ran a hand through his hair, looking down at his coffee before meeting her gaze again. "I came into this with all the wrong intentions. I agreed to the blind date because of a stupid bet, and I was an idiot. I judged you before even meeting you." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing, letting him continue. "But that night, from the moment you walked in, I realized how wrong I was. And then spending time with you, getting to know you, it made me realize how shallow I've been my whole life. You made me see things differently, Sarah. And for the first time, I felt like I didn't have to pretend to be someone I was not." Sarah's eyes softened slightly, but she still held her guard. "So why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning?" Mark sighed. "Because I was scared. I didn't want you to think that I only started liking you out of guilt. But the truth is, I've never met anyone like you before. You're kind, intelligent, and real in a way I didn't even know I needed." Sarah studied him for a long moment, and Mark felt his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, she let out a small breath. "You hurt me, Mark, when I found out about the bet. I felt like everything between us was just fake, and I don't want to be someone's lesson learned." Mark leaned forward earnestly. "It was never fake, Sarah. Not after that first night. You taught me that love isn't about appearances or fitting into some perfect mold. It's about connection, and I don't want to lose that." Sarah remained silent for a few seconds, processing his words. Mark could see the internal battle within her, the hesitation, the lingering hurt, but also the undeniable connection they had shared. "Mark," she finally said, her voice softer now, "I appreciate your honesty, and I won't lie. This whole thing hurt more than I expected it to. But I can see you're trying. And that means something." Mark's face lit up with hope. "Does that mean you'll give me another chance?" Sarah offered a small, cautious smile. "It means we can start over. But this time, no expectations, no assumptions. Just us figuring it out as we go." Relief flooded through Mark, and he smiled back. "I wouldn't want it any other way." They sat in silence for a moment, the tension slowly melting away. Mark reached for his coffee, and Sarah did the same, their hands brushing slightly. This time she didn't pull away as they finished their drinks. Mark glanced at Sarah with a newfound sense of appreciation. "So no more bets," Sarah teased, a playful glint in her eye. Mark laughed, raising his hands in surrender. "I swear. Lesson learned." Sarah smirked. "Good. Because if you try anything like that again, I might just write about it in a very unflattering way in one of my books. Mark grinned. Fair enough. Just promise you'll at least... So, no more bets? Sarah teased, a playful glint in her eye. Mark laughed, raising his hands in surrender. I swear, lesson learned. Sarah smirked. Good. Because if you try anything like that again, I might just write about it in a very unflattering way in one of my books. Mark grinned. Fair enough. Just promise you'll at least change my name. Sarah chuckled, and for the first time in days, the atmosphere between them felt light again. The wall she had put up began to lower, and Mark knew this was his chance to show her that he wasn't the man she once thought he was. Would you like to take a walk like last time? Mark asked hesitantly. Sarah pretended to think for a moment before nodding. I'd like that. They left the cafe together, stepping into the crisp night air. Mark glanced at Sarah beside him and realized something profound. This time, there were no expectations, no shallow assumptions. Just two people taking it one step at a time, and that was more than enough. Months passed, and with each passing day, Sarah and Mark's relationship grew stronger, built on a foundation of trust, mutual respect, and a newfound understanding of what truly mattered. Mark had changed in ways he never thought possible. The man who once cared so much about appearances now found himself valuing the things that couldn't be seen at first glance. Kindness, resilience, and the quiet confidence Sarah exuded so naturally. Sarah, in turn, had learned to let her guard down. She no longer questioned whether Mark's affection was real. She saw in his actions, the way he listened, the way he stood up for her, and the way he encouraged her to chase her dreams without hesitation, that this love was real. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real. One evening, as Sarah was finishing up at her bookstore, Mark walked in with a nervous smile. He carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, her favorite. Got a minute? He asked, leaning against the counter. Sarah grinned. For you? Always. He placed the flowers on the counter and cleared his throat. So, I was thinking, my friends are having a get-together this weekend, and I'd really like for you to come. Sarah raised an eyebrow playfully. Are you sure? Your friends might be surprised to see you with someone who doesn't fit the usual mold. Mark shook his head, taking her hand gently. I don't care about that anymore, Sarah. You're the most important person in my life, and I want them to know that. Sarah's eyes softened, and she squeezed his hand. Then I'd love to go. At the party, Mark confidently introduced Sarah to his friends. Everyone, this is Sarah. And before you say anything, yes, she's amazing, and no, I don't care what you think. His friends exchanged surprised glances, but soon enough, Sarah charmed them with her intelligence and humor. Even Jake, who had once made fun of the idea of Mark dating her, pulled Mark aside and admitted, I get it now, man. She's different in a good way. Mark simply smiled. Yes, she is. And in that moment, he realized just how much he had grown. A few days later, Mark and Sarah found themselves back at Café Lumière, their no favorite spot, the place where it had all begun. They sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker outside, sipping their coffee in comfortable silence. Sarah leaned her head against Mark's shoulder, sighing contentedly. You know, I never thought a blind date could change my life. Mark chuckled. Me neither, but I'm really glad it did. Sarah smiled, lacing her fingers with his. Me too. Mark looked at her, feeling something he had never felt before. Peace. He finally understood that love wasn't about perfection, or appearances, or meeting society's expectations. It was about finding someone who makes you better, who sees you for who you really are. As they sat there, sharing laughter and stories, Mark knew he had found something truly priceless, a genuine, honest love that surpassed anything he had ever imagined. And that was more than enough. And so, Mark and Sarah's story reminds us that love isn't about appearances. It's about connection, understanding, and finding someone who sees the real you. Sometimes, the most unexpected encounters can lead to the most beautiful journeys. Thank you for joining us on Mark and Sarah's incredible journey, a tale of unexpected encounters, self-discovery, and the transformative power of genuine connection. From a blind date sparked by shallow expectations to a bond built on honesty, vulnerability, and a willingness to change, their story reminds us that true love often emerges when we look beyond appearances and embrace the real person within. Their journey teaches us that sometimes the most beautiful relationships are born from taking a chance on the unknown and learning to appreciate what truly matters. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring journeys. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and like the video to help us grow our community. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.